Hey everybody, and welcome into this video, which is about two topics really. The Declaration of Independence and the ideas Jefferson had that went into that, and then the real perplexing question, which is how on earth is the American military going to defeat what was at the time the most powerful army in Europe? It's hard enough to think of France, an established powerful nation, beating England. They didn't do that very often, in fact at all at the time period. But now you've got a brand new nation that was just formed of 13 states that don't get along very well. And all of a sudden, they're going to somehow rise up and beat the most mighty military probably on the planet, at least in Europe? How's that possible? Well, it's because it really didn't happen that way. I mean, they won, but not really. You'll see what I mean. So we'll break into those two things today. And if you're watching this and your class has already broken down the Declaration of Independence, you can skip that part. It'll say right in the Google Classroom exactly where you can skip ahead to in the video because you've already broken this down in class. But if you have not done that yet, mostly that's for the people who are supposed to be in class tomorrow on the 17th, December 17th, then you want to watch the entire thing because I'm not going to see you again in person until 2021. So this will take you through what we were going to do in class together today, as well as add on the other stuff that everyone's going to get over the course of the next couple of days as we do meet Monday and Tuesday next week. So we'll all be on the same page when we get back from break in 2021, and that's going to be on the 4th of January, which is a Monday. So let's get into it. And starting off with the Declaration of Independence. So we talked about the Olive Branch Petition and what they attempted to do with that peace offering, and how it failed. And when it failed, and England responded by sending more troops and essentially saying we're going to hang traitors, it did unify people together that the British were in the wrong. But as far as declaring independence, that was a bit tougher. A postponement was given on a vote, meaning they pushed off voting, and that allowed a declaration committee of 5 people to get together and start to talk about a convincing document that would show Americans as well as foreign countries why America had decided to rebel and how come we were the good guys. Thomas Jefferson wrote it. He was an outstanding writer, and he was the one entrusted to put the document on paper, and he borrows very heavily from John Locke. So this is exactly what I gave you in your Google Classroom and had 4 questions that I asked you to kind of take a look at, to answer. And we'll go over those right now as far as what's in this document. Well, the first part of the document right here, just the introductory part, is Jefferson basically saying it's okay to fight back against an abusive government. And he's talking about the aspect of John Locke. John Locke is the one who came up with the social contract, that if the government protects the rights of the people, then the people will follow the government. But if a government doesn't protect the rights of the people, then you need to change the government by whatever means necessary. And that's what he kind of says here. That first section up above, he's basically saying that sometimes governments do break the social contract. And when that happens, people have to take action. And he mentions in that second section, the lower of those two on your screen, what John Locke would say. These things are simply true, he says. That's where the self-evident truth comes in. Everyone's equal, and everyone's got inalienable rights endowed by their creator. And if you remember John Locke, Locke says your creator is whatever you think it is. Whether you believe in the Christian God, wonderful. Locke won't tell you not to. If you don't believe in God and you're an atheist or some other type of thinker when it comes to religion, you've still got rights. Maybe they're natural rights. You get them from nature by being born. Either way, they're yours. And he says the 3 big ones, Jefferson says now, are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Government's there to protect and secure those rights. England hasn't done it. So anytime a government doesn't secure your rights, the people have the right to abolish it and make a new government. So in the first part of the Declaration of Independence, you didn't know this yet, but you actually already knew what Jefferson said if you knew John Locke. It's just John Locke's social contract. And he's picking Locke for a reason. The big one being, you're now throwing an English philosopher's words back at England, kind of really highlighting that England is kind of breaking their own rules and philosophies. Now the second part, if you're Jefferson and you're trying to convince people, they might say, yeah, you're right, Tom. when governments do abuse their people, that people can rebel. But tell me, Tom, how has England abused the people? Well, I'm glad you asked, Tom might say. Let me list off the ways England has abused our rights. And I only gave you a few of them. But the bulk of the document is England, or Jefferson rather, listing off English rights abuses. Now, he's blaming the king, even though it's really Parliament, the British Congress, who's made these rules more often than not. But it's a lot easier to focus your attention and dislike or even hatred on a single person. So we'll make King George the scapegoat. Unfair, but a lot easier to kind of focus on him and get people together to do that. Jefferson says the history of the present king is a history of repeated injuries, the establishment of absolute tyranny. To prove this, we're going to show you these facts. Here's how he's done it. And I gave you 5. He's dissolved representative houses repeatedly. Remember when he told the Massachusetts government they couldn't meet anymore and he replaced them with the king's picks? As part of the intolerable acts? That's what he's talking about. He's kept among us, in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He sent during peacetime the military to become a colony's police force. He did that in Boston after the Townsend Acts, really, and the reaction to them. We didn't ask for these soldiers. He sent them. And he didn't even check with our legislatures. He is affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. What he means by that is the military just takes matters into their own hands, and they rule places without any authority basically watching over them except the government and military itself. It really means the military can do whatever they want, as they did in Boston. For quartering large bodies of troops among us. That he's talking about the Quartering Act, when people were forced to house soldiers. He's waged war against us, declared us out of his protection. He's branded us rebels and traitors. And on and on and on. He lists a whole bunch. And the reason for that is that he's a lawyer. And if you're a lawyer and you're trying to prove your point, and I say this to you as well when you write papers for me, I want to see evidence. Don't tell me something, show it to me. And the more evidence you have to show, the more likely you are to convince somebody that you are right. So he is trying to convince the Pennsylvania Tories, who are very skeptical, and the doubting planters down in the southern part of the country. He's given lots of evidence to them. That's his goal. And that's what most of that document is. Most of the sentences in the Declaration start with "he has." And there's a lot of that. So he lists all the ways, dozens and dozens, that England has violated American rights. He also points out here, we've petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. They've been answered only with repeated injury. In other words, we tried peaceful methods, including recently the Olive Branch petition. But he won't listen. What do you want us to do? Ask pretty, please? The king's a tyrant, and tyrants don't listen. Therefore, we've got to do what we're doing here, as he says in part 4. We are now free and independent states. Connection with the British is totally dissolved, and we as a country can do whatever we want to that any country can do. So basically, the conclusion to all this is England, we're making a new government by canceling yours and building ours. And we can do what any country can do. Now, they don't come out and say it, but one of those things countries can do is declare war. We don't declare war on England. But by saying this, Jefferson understands how England's going to take this. They won't read this Declaration of Independence and say, okay, I guess America's free, nothing we can do. They're going to say, I don't think so, and send even more troops, and essentially wrap up and round up the 57 men who signed this document and hang them as traitors. So we're not going to wait for them to declare war on us. We'll imply we're declaring war on them because this document means it's going to happen. And it's amazing 57 men signed this document because they know full well they are now putting their lives at risk. That's what that last part's all about. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. We're all signing this, and if it goes bad, we'll all go down together, and our lives and everything we own are at risk. They were right, by the way. A lot of these folks, Some of them died. But even more of them lost their fortunes and lost their entire earnings and what they had as far as wealth was concerned. And, of course, you can't forget religion in this country. That's where that divine providence line comes in. We're hoping for God's help here. That's what the firm reliance in divine providence is. So Jefferson wasn't a huge Christian himself, but he knew many Americans were, and he threw that in there as well, because we've always kind of had some religious element to people in this country, in these colonies. So he threw that in there too, trying to be inclusive to all types of colonies and people. Thing is, though, this document means nothing unless America is able to win its war against England, and, well, that doesn't seem very likely at all. How's America going to win? Now, if I showed you this chart and I simply said red team versus blue team and there's going to be a war, and I asked you who's going to win, you'd hopefully say red team. Because look at all the advantages the British Army had. Professional trained soldiers, way more numbers, experienced military generals, including on the water with their massive navy, which gives them a huge transportation advantage. They're a wealthy nation. They can hire more soldiers, trained professional mercenaries that'll fight on their side. They've got tons of supplies and continue to make more and ship them right to their troops. Manufacturing, they've got factories, can make a whole bunch of stuff. And they have the heavy weapons, artillery and cannons. What do we got? Well, a couple of things, I guess. Motivation. Definitely an American advantage because the Americans are fighting for their actual freedom, whereas British soldiers are mostly doing a job. And Americans had home field, but it wasn't a huge advantage because even though Americans lived in these colonies, it wasn't like England was unfamiliar with them. And the terrain itself in the east coast of America is not very different from the terrain in England. It's not like all of a sudden the British are fighting a jungle war in places where they had no real ability to train for a jungle war. That was America's issue in the Vietnam War, by the way. We don't have a lot of jungles. And then to try to train our men to fight in a jungle against a army or enemy that is very well versed in fighting there, that was difficult. But that's not the situation here. I mean, England's landscape and America's landscape are pretty much the same. So looking at this chart, it seems like England simply can't lose. And you know, they shouldn't have. And even when they do lose, they're not defeated. And I'll tell you what I mean by that as this rolls on. Now, we could spend a lot of time in the American Revolution as far as the war is concerned. And I don't, because if you do that at all, you start getting really into a lot of different, and to me, very interesting and enjoyable stories about battles and things like that. But really, especially this year in our more limited time, I'm not teaching you how to be generals. It's very interesting stuff, and you should explore it if you're interested in it. So I'm just going to give you kind of the short version, the basic version of how America is able to win this war, because that's a question we should absolutely answer, because it seems so unlikely that it would happen. So I'll take you through it, kind of piece by piece. The war starts about a month later. England had already sent troops to New York, not Boston, because Boston was kind of a pain for England the last decade or so. So they figured they'd go to New York. And you can see where my arrow points to on the screen. That is Long Island and New York City. The other thing about that, too, is that if they capture that, they were going to somewhat cut off New England from the rest of the colonies and save it for last, kind of isolate it up there. That was their idea. And England brings a whole bunch of troops to New York, and a battle takes place, and it's a major British victory. Washington gets his butt kicked here. It's not close. Washington is stomped by the British, who have every advantage, especially the fact that Long Island is an island, and trying to fight a nation with a strong army and capture an island is not easy to do, especially when that nation has a strong navy as well. So Washington ends up losing half his men. Now, most aren't killed, but they desert, meaning that when the battle's over and the American army is retreating and running for their lives, a lot of these guys say, all right, the heck with this, I'm going home because I got a wife and family that depends on me. In this society, men were really the ones who earned income and took care of their families. Women didn't have jobs. They weren't the ones who were breadwinners. So if you're a guy, you got to think, all right, I'm fighting for my country, but that's a noble cause and all, but why would I do that if there's no way we can win? What good is it to me to fight an unwinnable fight that's just going to leave my family stranded? Nah, I'm going home. So you got to kind of understand why many of them did that, and a lot did. And really, that should have been the end of it right there. Really, this should be the last battle of the war. But it wasn't, because General Howe pursues the Americans all around New York and New Jersey. I'll show you where I mean by that. Kind of up here and down to this area. But he stops that pursuit in mid-November because the British, all throughout this war, do not fight during the wintertime. They go back to headquarters, resupply, restock up, and take it up again in the spring. If they just continued the fight to chase Washington, they probably could have ended things right there in the first few months. But they don't. The British military makes a key mistake here, and Washington is able to head south to New Jersey. And that leads us to the next battle. Washington doesn't have much of an army left, and he's almost surrounded. And in December of 1776, he launches an attack on Trenton, which is in New Jersey. Going back one slide, I'll show you where I mean here. New Jersey, this one right here, and Trenton's right about where my arrow is, right over there. Actually, up here further. There it is. Washington needs an attack. He needs a win, in fact, because I told you his men were leaving and deserting. Well, a lot had stayed because they signed a contract, and they're going to honor the contract and the promise they made to the military. But their promise ends January 1st. And a lot of the men, they already knew were going home. Because, again, why stay and fight if you can't win? The only way you can convince Americans to stay in the Army is victory. Washington knew it. So on Christmas morning, 1776, actually more Christmas evening, it's not really morning, it's evening, I have that incorrect. Washington, as you see in this picture, crosses the Delaware River. And he and his men attack a Hessian camp. Hessians are those paid mercenaries I was mentioning earlier. They're Germans from the Alps, Bavaria region in Germany. Real good professional soldiers. But it's Christmas, and no one's expecting an attack on Christmas. That ought to show you exactly how desperate Americans were as far as trying to win a battle and win an attack to keep this war going. And that was a victory for the American soldiers. It didn't really do an awful lot in the long run, but in the short run, the biggest thing that it was able to do was to allow the men who were thinking about leaving to sign those contracts and stay. And even some of the men who left end up returning. Now, usually in that situation, if you're a deserter, you get jailed and you get shot. But Washington couldn't afford to do that. He had to let his men come back. Because if he doesn't do that, if he doesn't allow people to come back, then he's down numbers and he desperately needs numbers right now. So he does survive that first year. Remember, if the British had just finished chasing him and caught up to him before he gets to Trenton, the whole thing is probably over. They don't do that. It's a major mistake. That leads into the second year of the war, 1777. And there's a few battles that take place here. Some of the ones that are listed, Monmouth Courthouse and Brandywine. Most of these take place in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And for the most part, we're not going to get into too detail of this. They're mostly stalemates. Technically, they're British victories because they're gaining territory. But neither side's getting any real advantage here. The thing is, though, a stalemate is mostly bad for the American forces because they're so outnumbered and have such a supply disadvantage that if you keep having stalemates, you're going to run out of supplies and men way before the British are. So while 1777 is better than 76 was, there was no stomping like there was at Long Island. It's not going overly well for the American military, and if it continues like this, things won't end well for the Americans. But luckily, 1778 is better. What Washington does, he actually splits his troops and is fighting in two fronts. One half goes to Virginia, more on them later. The other half has moved north into upstate New York. And where they are in upstate New York is trying to draw the British away from their headquarters and leave and kind of split them up to make those forces a little bit more spread out. Hold on just one second. I'll be right back with you. I don't think I covered anything with my flag. Did I? Randy, did I cover something? Do my flags cover something? It does. Okay. Okay, fine. Just checking on a thing in my room. A repair is getting done, so back to this. Three things happen here in New York in 1778. The first thing, check out this one. Right there, that arrow, that's General John Burgoyne. Burgoyne's job is to head south of Fort Ticonderoga to Albany, New York. In doing so, he makes a bunch of mistakes. See, he's really overconfident and not exactly the best leader. The British promoted people based on their societal rank, a lot of family promotions, and that meant sometimes that more qualified individuals who are more highly skilled didn't get the job, where folks who were connected did. Some things never change. But Burgoyne was really not fit to be in charge of this military, and he makes a bunch of mistakes heading down south. One thing that he does is he brings way too much stuff, his own personal things. He has like about 19 different wagons just for his personal belongings. And that slows him down. Not to mention Americans have blocked some of the trails, but he's going really, really slow, sometimes as much as a mile a day. Not a mile an hour, a mile a day. So it takes him a long time to get down there. When he does, he's going to camp in a place that's kind of surrounded by hills, not use scouts, and get himself surrounded. The guy really didn't know what he was doing. He had a whole bunch of mistakes overall. Yeah, Boy Scouts would tell you want to be prepared in situations like this. John Burgoyne was not a Boy Scout and was not somebody who should have been in charge of the British military. His other problem, too, was he even lost more men. So what he tried to do was go foraging for food, and he ends up crossing the border into Vermont. And Vermont's kind of like a rural Massachusetts. The people there were very much anti-British. And he got himself attacked by John Stark. His name's right there on the right. And Stark kind of kicks him out of Vermont and weakens the British Army a little bit. Either way, Burgoyne does get down to Albany. He does his job. But what he's expecting now is reinforcements from one of his buddies, a general named Barry St. Leger. He's this guy going this way. Down to Fort Oswego, he's going to cross and meet up over here in Albany. Now you can see, he never gets there. That's because Benedict Arnold meets him and stops him and turns him back, about 75 miles away. The help Burgoyne wanted never happens. Now, you may have heard of Benedict Arnold later, because he's very famous for later in this war, because he doesn't feel he gets enough credit for the victory here. He does kind of decide to turn traitor and join the British. But for now, still a major American hero. And without the help, Burgoyne's on his own at Saratoga. And that, right down here, is where Horatio Gates and Daniel Morgan ambush him at the bottom of those hills, surround him, and he surrenders really quickly because he knows he can't win being surrounded. He also brought his family with him. He was so thinking he was going to win, so overconfident, that he brings a lot of personal belongings, even his family, and not wanting to put his family at risk. He ends up surrendering really quickly. This battle doesn't end the war. And it's not even the first American big victory. That was Trenton. But the thing here, though, is it's the first time the Americans have actually beaten the British, not a bunch of unprepared German mercenaries on Christmas night. Mercenaries quit when the going gets tough. They're only in it for the money. But the British military, this is a major victory. It doesn't end the war, but here's what it does. This is what gets us France. The result at Saratoga is why France enters this war. Now, France doesn't like English, and France has a realistic reason to get involved to help us now that they think it's actually possible for America to maybe win. They want to regain Canada, which, if you recall, they lost in the French and Indian War. So France sends us a bunch of soldiers, good chunk of Navy, whole bunch of supplies, even lends us some money. So a lot of these advantages are not nearly as big advantages for the British as they used to be. And they're led by some pretty famous people, the Comte de Rochambeau, and this young guy right here, the Marquis de Lafayette, 21 years old. He's a major leader who works with Washington, especially working very closely with George Washington down in the South to combine forces and eventually defeat the British. Can't do that without France's help, and Saratoga gets us France. It almost doesn't matter. That's what the word moot means. This almost turns out to not matter because Washington has to go back to New Jersey and meet the French, and he gets stuck in the wintertime at Valley Forge. Now, Valley Forge, famous National Historical Park. You can visit it today. It's not far from Philadelphia. Not the place you want to be because you're surrounded by Quaker Tories who aren't really all that helpful as far as your supplies. And Washington was very low on supplies. It was miserable. Men didn't have enough to eat. A lot of them were shoeless. And it was a vicious bitter winter in 1778. I would say if you ever want to do a reenactment and recreation, and someone said, why don't you join our Valley Forge recreation, say no. Because Valley Forge recreation means you sit outside in the cold, freezing wintertime, shiver a lot, don't eat very much, end up boiling leather to eat that sometimes, and really spending your life being miserable. Now, the one good thing from this is if you survive a miserable experience, it makes you stronger mentally. And they did survive this. And they also got stronger militarily because Washington called in a buddy of his that he knew from his time as a British soldier. And the guy's name was Friedrich von Steuben. He was a Prussian, which is a country that doesn't exist anymore, Central Europe. Von Steuben had no love for the British, knew Washington, and he came in and taught Washington's men hand-to-hand combats, which meant how to fight with bayonets. Now remember Bunker Hill? The reason Americans lost, they ran out of ammo, couldn't fight hand-to-hand. Well, von Steuben rectifies that situation and makes it so the American military is much more suited to hand-to-hand combat. You don't want to get into it if you can help it. But if you do, now you've got a chance. Valley Forge was not a fun place, not at all. But it does make the American military stronger in the winter of 1778. And when springtime comes, Washington does go and meet with his French allies. The next couple of years I call the quagmire, which means it's a long, slow process without a whole lot getting done. England has a plan. They're going to go to where I've labeled on the map, the Carolinas, south and north. And they came up with what's called the Carolina Strategy. There's a new general in charge of the Southern Army. His name is Charles Cornwallis, and he was a pretty good general. And Cornwallis's plan was going to be to capture the coastal city of Charleston, South Carolina, and then push Washington's army back to New York. It would take a while to do this, but once it was done, you now have Washington sandwiched between two very sizable chunks of the British military, trapping them, surrounding them, and probably forcing Washington to surrender. And England thought they'd be able to do this because they expected help from the wealthy Southern Tories, who they were the ones who didn't want war in the first place because they had business and trade ties to England. They thought, the British did, that the Tories would help them. And at first the Tories did help. But they didn't count on that class struggle that still existed in the South and hadn't changed much since Bacon's Rebellion way back when. There are a lot more poor people in the South who didn't have much wealth, and man, oh man, did they resist the ones who did. So no help came for the British because when the rich Southerners started to help, they were attacked by the poor Southerners, and a class war broke out down there, and it got vicious. The British were horrified by what they saw. So they had to start and continue doing this plan without getting much help at all as Cornwallis pushed north. He was on his own. And to make it worse down there for Cornwallis, a lot of these poor American landowners, the folks out there in the backwater, they started to form rebel groups. There were lots of these, and the most famous one is the one led by a guy named Francis Marion, whose name was the Swamp Fox, nickname was. And they used guerrilla tactics, which meant hit-and-run tactics. It's based on a French word, la guerre, which means war. Guerrilla tactics mean quick, small attacks. You hit, you leave. It's a tactic very useful if you're the smaller, weaker military, trying to slowly wear down a larger one. Now, this is where home field advantage comes in, because the swamps in the southern part of this country were one place England didn't have a whole lot of battle experience. So what would happen is that these men would be led by Francis Marion and others, attack from the swamp, kill a few British, and then disappear back into the swamp again before they could get surrounded and caught. You didn't want to stay very long if you are a militia doing this. The longer you fight, the longer the British can now surround you. And if that happens, you're toast. But if you can pick off a couple and leave, then do it again the next day, over time that wears down the British military. And that's exactly what it did. It's kind of like getting attacked by black flies in the summertime. No matter what, the black flies win. They attack you. You can swat some. But if you walk through a forest filled with black flies, you're going to come through with a lot of bites. You can't swat them all. Same thing for the British here. They're getting attacked by these little black fly militia groups. And yeah, sometimes they surround and kill them. But usually those groups get away, and little by little they start wearing down the British. And that's why by 1781 that Southern campaign had failed. Cornwallis is in the South. The head commander of the British military at the headquarters in New York was General Henry Clinton. And these two guys, Cornwallis and Clinton, didn't like each other. Cornwallis didn't like Clinton because Clinton got the job of head general when the original one, General Howe, retired back before the Battle of Saratoga in 1778. When Howe retired, Cornwallis felt he should be the new head commander, but Clinton got the job. And Cornwallis always resented that. In 1781, with that Southern strategy failing, Clinton ordered Cornwallis to head to the coast. He was going to get picked up by the Navy. They were going to bring him back to New York, and the British were going to come up with Plan B. Cornwallis blew off the order, basically thinking that Clinton doesn't know what he's talking about, and he can handle things himself down here because he is a better general than Clinton. And while Cornwallis may have been right about that he may have been a better general than Clinton, it was a big mistake to blow off the orders for a couple of reasons. The problem is that summer, as he heads up into Virginia, he ends up on the coast in Yorktown. Unbeknownst to him, the Americans and French are waiting for him, and when he gets there, they drive him to the coast. Now, Cornwallis goes to the water because Cornwallis knows the British Navy is very strong. And he sends a messenger north asking for help because he's now surrounded. You can see him on land. I'll show you right here. Rochambeau, Washington, right there on land, have him surrounded on the ocean. Nowhere for Cornwallis to go. And all they do is wait. It's called a siege. You sit there and you surround your opponent and let him run out of supplies, and then he's forced to surrender. Well, Cornwallis thinks, I'm getting help from my buddy Clinton. I sent a message north, and the message did get through. But Clinton did not send help. You might be able to imagine why. He already ordered Cornwallis to get out once, and Cornwallis blew him off, and now he's thinking, oh, buddy, you made this mess. You clean it up. Cornwallis is expecting help, and it's not the English Navy that arrives. It's the French Navy. So now the poor guy is surrounded on land and sea. And for a little while, he makes an effort to try to shoot his way out of it, but it's not going to work. And he eventually surrenders in the summer of 1781 at this battle in Virginia known as Yorktown. Now, when he surrenders, here's the famous picture drawn of that, as Cornwallis has to hand his sword up to George Washington, who's sitting on his horse. So you're surrendering to a guy who's taller and bigger than you. It's definitely a show of submission. You know, Cornwallis didn't even want to surrender to Washington. He tried to surrender to Rochambeau, the French general, and Rochambeau said, no, Washington. Surrender to him instead. Really humiliating to have to surrender to an American guy who was only a colonel in your army. But the thing about this is, I doubt that both Clinton and Cornwallis would have taken this approach if they knew that this would be the last battle of the war. But it was. England still had plenty of troops and supplies left. They could have kept going, but they did what's called a cost analysis. Is this worth it? And they thought, after 5 years of fighting, and we haven't gotten anywhere near winning, this ain't worth it. Think of it. In 5 years, all we got was New York. And we got that the first month. Since then, we've gotten nothing. France is now in. The Americans are winning battles. We could win, but it would take the same kind of troop buildup, and probably worse, than we did back in the French and Indian War. And that's just too expensive. So England decides, after the Battle of Yorktown, to pull the plug. They quit, surrender, and say war's over, and they acknowledge American independence and say, you guys win your own country. Now, they expected that we would fall flat in our face as a nation, and they're almost right. We'll get to that story next year. By next year, I mean 2021. We'll talk about it in this class. But at the time, it was a good gamble. Why spend the money to try to fight to keep a people with you who don't want to be, where you can let them fall on their face and beg to have you come back? So they surrender. And America gets its independence, and that declaration now is actually worth something, as we, after 5 years of warfare, managed to beat the British. They're not beaten. And we were mostly lucky, it seems to me, more than skillful. But England decides it's just not worth the fight anymore, and they give up. France doesn't get Canada back, though. That's the weird part of the story, because we don't want France to have territory in our neighborhood. They had helped us, yes, but they weren't our allies. They only helped us because we had a common enemy, England. And now England's been beaten. I'm not sure France and America would be good friends now. And Americans didn't want to take the chance. So in the treaty negotiations, America actually teamed up with England to make sure France didn't get any of Canada. Up there in pink is what England got. Now, England was smart. This may surprise some of you who are familiar that not far from here is French-speaking Quebec, speaking French to this day. England was smart. They practiced that old policy of salutary neglect on Quebec. They did not try to change the language or the religion of those French-speaking Catholics who were living up in Quebec. They left them the heck alone. That's smart, because those folks would have resisted and fought back. And the last thing England wanted was a war. So England's philosophy was, hey, you guys can keep speaking French, and you guys can continue to be Catholics. We don't care. Just as long as you don't make any trouble, we're fine with you. People of Quebec kind of were like the people of America, just want to be left alone. So it worked out that way. And those French-speaking Canadians were really English for the next almost 200 years. Canada doesn't get full independence until 1967. But French people left alone still speak French today. This was really risky, though. If France had gotten that territory, they probably would have invaded us at some point. And then England would not have bailed us out. They would have laughed at us. Oh, France is a problem, you say. Well, guess you should have thought of that before you guys kicked us out. So we didn't want to take any chances. That's why we did that. It's going to be a struggle for us to build our own nation, and we'll get into how that happens later on. But that was a series of really fortunate, lucky events with some skill mixed in. I don't want to take all the skill away from some of our generals, but there was a lot of luck involved with that skill that allows America to maybe not defeat England, but make them uncomfortable enough so the British quit. We'll take a look at our new nation coming up in 2021. This is your last thing before Christmas or holiday break. I hope you really enjoy that time off. You guys have had to adapt an awful lot to a new method of classes this year. I think you're doing great. I've been really happy with your work. I'm eager to see you in 2021, but I congratulate you, and I want to tell you I'm proud of what you've done here in 2020.